The telling mind, the brain's persuasive mechanisms of a story. What happens in the brain when we listen to a story? Communication between people is one of the most complex and mysterious processes in the world. How, for example, do we manage to convey ideas through words? How do we manage to influence other people or convince them of our positions? How does the context affect our understanding of the message? Stories are fundamental aspects of communication and human cognition, and they play a crucial role in shaping our understanding of the world and ourselves. The social component of stories may explain why they arouse in human evolution. Folktales are a specific example of communication that has an extensive social impact. Folktales have been used as a didactic means and as a means of social persuasion to adopt norms and values accepted by the society. Let us start with a famous folktale from the Jewish culture that appears in the Babylonian Talmud. The astrologist prophesied to Rabbi Akiva that on her wedding day, his daughter would be bitten by a poisonous snake and she would die. The great sage was faced with a cruel question: how do you deal with such a prophecy? The Talmud tells us what he chose to do, and how the daughter were saved. In the night of her wedding, the daughter pinned her hairpin in the wall and went to sleep. In the morning, she tells her father that on the night, while all the guests were busy with the wedding meal, she heard a knock at the door. At the door stood a poor man asking for food. She took her food and gave it to him. Rabbi Akiva listens to her story, and immediately a sentence comes out of his mouth: charity will save you from death. The act she did helped her change her fate. Her actions changed the world. Thanks to the act of charity, the fate that was decreed for her at birth changes and she gets to live. In fact, the story tries to change human behavior. The story wants to influence us to care not only for ourselves, but also for others around us. The fascinating question is, how does the story manage to make it? What are the brain persuasion mechanisms of the story? A well-known anecdote attributes to Hemingway the shortest story in the world: for sale, baby shoes, never worn. What makes 6 words a story? In one word, the plot. What is a plot? The English writer A.M. Forster gave the following example: the king is dead, the queen is dead, not a story. The king died, and the queen died of grief. Yes, a story. In order for a series of events to become a story, the events have to be connected to each other in some internal causal relationship. Without causal connections between the events, there is no plot, and therefore, no story either. The most essential element of the story is the meaning it gives to the events. In this way, the story differs from a chronicle, which is the simple and chronological record of the events according to a time order. Understanding a story involves more than just understanding the words and grammar. The brain also needs to understand the plot, recognize patterns, and predict future events. Understanding the events of the plot and the connections between them requires the active involvement of the prefrontal cortex, PFC, known for its executive functions such as decision-making and problem-solving. It helps us understand the narrative structure and anticipate what might happen next. For example, in the studies of Yuri Hassan on storytelling, brain synchronization between the narrator and the listener occurred only when the listener understood the meaning of the story. In cases where the researchers confused the word order of the story, no brain synchronization occurred at all. All the studies found that only a coherent story produces in our mind a communication that encourages empathy and understanding. The classic structure of the plot takes place in 5 acts: exposition, conflict, rising action, climax, and solution. Why does the plot mean so much to the brain? The structure of the plot produces tension, curiosity, and emotional reward. Tension about what is going to happen next causes an increase in cortisol. Curiosity and anticipation of the future produce dopamine. The emotional reward is given to us at the end, in the form of the secretion of the hormone oxytocin. Narrative transportation. The book Little Women accompanied me for many years in my childhood. I read it over and over again. I imagined myself as the rebellious Jo, hiding in the attic and immersed in her books. I wept the tears of signs, every time again when Beth, the good little sister, died of her illness. Today I mostly cry at the movies, but I keep rolling with laughter when I go back and read about Uncle Podger trying to hang a picture in the book 3 in 1 boat. He reminds me of my beloved father, who was an intellectual man but had 2 left hands. Stories transport us into their world in ways that no other text can. The transportation is a process in which all mental systems and abilities are focused on the events that occur in the story. The transportation creates wake signals in the body, the heart and breathing accelerate, the stress hormones are released, and our attention is high. Stories encourage us to think about others and ourselves alike. We sympathize with the characters, or recoil from them, agree with the way they react to events, or disapprove of it. We also think about ourselves in a similar situation. What would we do in their place? How would we behave? The default system is responsible for processing social information, and it is activated in the brain when we are not engaged in any specific task. The role of the default system is to mediate between our emotions, which originate in the limbic system, and perceptual and cognitive information and rational thinking, which originate in the cortex. The brain areas belonging to the system are scattered throughout the brain. One of them, especially important, is called the temporopartial junction (TPJ). Since this area is involved in understanding the beliefs, desires, and intentions of others, it is necessary for understanding characters and their actions in stories. Researcher Mary Mordino-Young found that when people hear stories that fill them with a sense of inspiration, areas of their brains involved in tasks of internal reflection are activated. She hypothesizes that the activity reflects an attempt by the listener to imagine himself in the hero's situation, to feel his feelings and understand his actions. Her conclusion: stories generate social empathy. How does the narrative transportation affect our behavior? Engaging in the narrative world has effects that can be measured. The series of studies conducted by the scientist Paul Zak in his laboratory in Switzerland was able to prove that when a story leads the listener into his world, there is increased release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone also known as the love hormone. Oxytocin encourages the opposite behavior of the fight or flight response, by reducing the feeling of fear and increasing trust. Paul Zak wanted to understand why some people respond to stories and others less, so to build a model that tries to predict which viewers will agree to donate to a children's cancer fund after watching a video. The participants in the experiment were shown a video that included two real characters, Ben, a boy who appears in the film with no hair, and his father. Ben is only 2 years old, and he doesn't know that a brain tumor will end his life in a few months. Ben's father tells how hard it is for him to be happy around Ben because he knows what his future holds for him. But in the end, he finds within himself the strength to be truly happy for Ben, until his last breath. The people who watched Ben's story in the lab were asked to donate part of their profits from the experiment to charity. Most of them agreed to donate generously. The conclusion of the study was unequivocal: when we hear an exciting story with a coherent plot, our brain produces more oxytocin, which can make us more empathetic, cooperative, and generous. These findings suggest that emotionally engaging narratives inspire operations in the real world, in this case sending money to a stranger. The researchers used the neurological data to build a predictive model of donations to a cancer charity, their measure of story impact. The statistical model was able to predict whether a participant would donate money with an accuracy of 82%. That is, by measuring how the peripheral nervous system responds to a story by releasing oxytocin, it is possible to almost perfectly predict how the person will behave. The attention system. To understand how different types of narratives affect the brain, the participants were presented with another video, but in this time, the story had a flat structure without dramatic tension. Stories are fundamental aspects of communication and human cognition, and they play a crucial role in shape. The film shows a visit of Ben and his father to the zoo, but there is no direct mention of cancer. Ben looks at a giraffe and skips forward to look at the lions, while his father follows him. The participants did not know why they were watching Ben and his father, and were not sure what they were supposed to learn or understand from the story. Their abdomen wandered from the story, and were directed to scanning the room or to other thoughts and reflections. They lost of interest in the video, did not make an emotional connection with the characters, and they almost did not donate money to charity. Attention brain lives in an information-rich environment, so it must choose what to focus on and what to remember. Attention reflects the priority of the frontal lobe, which also changes depending on the circumstances. Since attention reflects the prioritization of the frontal lobe, it is influenced both by the mental state and by previous experience and knowledge. In terms of the story, the way to keep the audience's attention is to consistently increase the tension in the story. The sensory storage holds sensory information for a period of time long enough to pay attention to it. Each sense has its own unique storage mechanism, which is constantly bombarded with an abundance of new information, most of which does not receive attention and therefore fades away. If you are sitting on a chair while you are watching this movie, continuous sensory information is transmitted to you from the area of the body that is in contact with the chair. But if your attention was focused on things that you watched them, you were not aware until now of the fact that you are sitting on a chair. Sight is our main sense for receiving general information, and hearing is used by us to language acquisition. The visual record lasts for about half a second, while the auditory record lasts for several seconds. In this short period of time, the receiver must pay attention to the stimulus. If the stimulus has not received attention, it is lost. Our attention can be thought of as a flashlight shining in the dark. Using the spotlight is an expensive metabolic resource, so we use it sparingly. Stories are emotionally rewarding. Good stories give us an emotional reward in the form of pleasure and enjoyment. Although Aristotle did not know the mind, he called the special feeling of pleasure born in us following a good story, even though it can be sad and tragic, as catharsis. The anticipation of the end of the story activates the area of the brain associated with reward and motivation. The main pathway in the brain associated with the feeling of pleasure is the mesolimbic pathway of the neurotransmitter dopamine. When the reinforcement system is activated, dopamine is released into an area called the nucleus accumbens. Listeners to stories who were engaged in the story and experienced emotional arousal had increased activity also in the ventral striatum and in the amygdala. These suggest that narrative engagement may be rewarding and enjoyable, which may explain why storytelling is such a widespread, enduring aspect of human culture. Many studies show that during a joint action, people covertly synchronize with each other on different levels: motoric, perceptual, and cognitive. In a series of studies based on reverse correlation was done by a research group led by Yuri Hassan, at Princeton University. When listening to a story, the brain activity of the listener becomes remarkably similar to the brain activity of the storyteller, and it continues that way throughout the story. It can be said that the story allows the speaker to transfer the thoughts, feelings, and images from his head directly to the listener's heads. Given that the same story can be understood in different ways, how can all listeners display similar brain responses when listening to a story? The researchers hypothesized that the level of similarity in higher order areas between people is mediated by the level of shared understanding. The findings suggested that the response was more similar between people who had a shared interpretation of the narrative, compared to people who did not. The greater the brain match between the listener and the storyteller, the better the listener understood the story and also remembered it better. Context affect the meaning. Sometimes people may interpret the exact same story in different ways. In a new experiment, Yuri Hassan used the story Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes, where a husband loses track of his wife in the middle of a party. Eventually the man calls his best friend and asks, "Have you seen my wife?" Half of the subjects in the study were told in advance that the woman was having an affair with the best friend, the other half is told that the wife is faithful and the husband is very jealous. Interestingly, this one sentence told to the subjects before the story began was enough to cause the brain responses of all the people who believed the wife was having an affair to be very similar in those higher order regions. If one sentence was enough to make a person's mind similar to people who had the same belief, in this case, the wife is cheating, and different from people who held a different belief that the husband is paranoid, imagine how this effect could be amplified in reality. Today, too many of us live in echo chambers where we are exposed to the same perspective day after day. We should all be concerned as a society if we lose our common ground and lose the ability to effectively communicate and share our views with people who are different from us. Hi, I'm Milo.